December 1952, Boscombe Down, England. A brand new British bomber is about to fly for the first time. And 2 weeks earlier, most of its airframe had been rolling down a country lane, wrapped in tarpaulin, hand-painted with the words "Boat," bound for Southampton. This is the story of the Handley Page Victor. By the end of this video, you'll know why that badly spelled sign wasn't even the strangest thing about this airplane. Why one version of it once took off with nobody actually deciding to fly it. Why 3 men on board had almost no way out if it went down. And why the country that built it eventually put the last one under a scrap crusher and filmed the whole thing. Go back to the summer of 1945 to see how Britain got here. The war is over, the country is broke, and the ally it just fought beside slams the door on nuclear cooperation with the 1946 Atomic Energy Act, the McMahon Act. London is cut off. If Britain wants to keep a seat at the superpower table and hold off the Soviet divisions massing across Europe, there's exactly one option left: build the bomb yourself and build something to carry it. In August 1946, that ambition became Operational Requirement OR 1001, a nuclear weapon no longer than 24 feet 2 inches, 5 feet across, weighing 10,000 pounds. To carry it and drop it blind from 50,000 feet, the Air Ministry issued Specification B.35/46. The original ask, OR 2030, had been almost fantasy. 2,000 nautical miles of range, a 200,000-pound takeoff weight. An empty treasury made that impossible, and the requirement got cut down to something the country could actually afford. The doctrine underneath it was arrogant in its simplicity. No guns, no tail turret, nothing to fight back with. Speed and altitude alone would keep the crew alive. Out of that gamble came 3 separate bombers, from 3 separate companies, competing to answer the same brief. History would call them the V-bombers. Handley Page's entry, the HP.80, looked like nothing else in the sky, and it was the riskiest bet of the 3. When the first prototype, WB-771, was partly built at the company's Radlett factory, engineers hit an almost comic problem. The runway there was too short to test fly it, so they took the bomber apart, loaded the sections onto trucks, and crawled it along public roads toward Boscombe Down, bulldozing hedgerows out of the way as they went. To keep the most secret airplane in Britain hidden from prying eyes along the route, security officers wrapped the fuselage in timber frames and canvas, disguised as ship parts headed for the docks. Someone painted the cover story onto the tarpaulin, Gelly Pandy, Southampton, an anagram, more or less, of Handley Page. Nobody checked the sign painter's spelling. He wrote Page as Pige, and Britain's most classified deterrent program rolled through English villages, advertising itself as a badly spelled boat. Despite the security farce, on December 24, 1952, Christmas Eve, Chief Test Pilot Hedley Hazelden took WB-771 up for its first flight, 17 minutes that went almost perfectly. 10 days later, the Air Ministry gave the aircraft its name, personally chosen by Winston Churchill, Victor. Britain had its winner. What nobody flying it that day understood yet was how much this name was about to cost. To validate something as radical as the Victor's crescent-wing, Handley Page needed real flight data fast, and building a full-scale prototype bomber from scratch would take years they didn't have. So in March 1948, the Air Ministry issued Specification E.648, calling for something almost unheard of, a scaled research aircraft, stitched together from whatever airframes were already lying around. Meet the HP.88, arguably the strangest airplane of the entire early jet age. At Blackburn's works in Brough, engineers grafted a fuselage from the Supermarine Attacker naval fighter, spliced in wing root sections from the Supermarine Swift, and bolted on a crescent wing, scaled to 36% of the real Victor's, topped with a matching T-tail. It carried 3 different names depending on who you asked. Handley Page called it the HP.88. Blackburn registered it as the YB-2. Supermarine insisted on Supermarine 521. But no amount of paperwork could fix one structural fact. The real Victor carried its wing-mounted mid-fuselage. The attacker's airframe forced the HP.88's wing down low, near the belly. Before it ever left the ground, this representative test aircraft was already lying about the thing it was built to represent. The mismatch punished them almost immediately. The crescent wing carried oversized trailing-edge flaps, and lowering them for landing violently disturbed the airflow, pitching the nose down hard. The normal fix is a bigger tailplane, but weight limits inherited from the attacker made that impossible. So engineers wired up something stranger, a fully automatic system that drooped both ailerons upward the instant the flaps came down, generating downforce at the wingtips to counter the pitch, plus a mechanical bob weight on the tailplane controls to stop the pilot from overcorrecting. Clever on paper. In practice, it meant letting an untested automatic system take hold of sensitive flight surfaces at high speed, with no way for the pilot to override it. The HP.88 first flew from Carnaby on June 21, 1951, with G.R.I. Parker at the controls. Almost immediately, it showed a violent pitch oscillation above 230 knots. Engineers kept tuning the system, eventually raising the safety limit to 450 knots. On August 26, 1951, preparing for a display at the Farnborough Air Show, test pilot Douglas Broomfield took the HP.88 low over Stansted, 300 feet, high speed. As the aircraft accelerated, the very bob weight system meant to protect it triggered a runaway instability in the tailplane controls instead. The aircraft pitched up and down with terrifying speed. The flight recorder recovered afterward showed the airframe took a bending load of plus or minus 12 Gs. 12 times the pull of gravity, snapping the structure back and forth in a matter of seconds. The HP.88 broke apart in mid-air, killing Broomfield instantly. It had existed for 36 days and flown for 14 hours. By the time it crashed, the two full-size HP.80 prototypes back at Radlett were nearly finished anyway. Broomfield's death added almost nothing to the aircraft it was built to save. History filed him away as a footnote in a chapter about a side project that failed. Step inside the cockpit of any of the three V-bombers, and the Victor gives itself away instantly. Vulcan and Valiant crews sat crammed into narrow, individual pressure compartments. Handley Page, instead, built one enormous unified cabin, running all the way to the aircraft's blunt chin, roomy enough that all 5 crew sat on the same open floor, staring out through wide, curved windows like they were riding in a flying lounge. There was a reason for the extravagance. The original plan was closer to science fiction. The entire nose section was supposed to detach at altitude and descend as its own escape capsule. In 1950, faced with the cost and the complexity, the Air Ministry quietly killed the idea. What replaced it was a much colder compromise. Only the 2 pilots up front got Martin Baker ejection seats. The 3 systems officers behind them, navigator/plotter, navigator radar, and air electronics officer, sat facing backward with nothing. Their escape plan, if it ever came to that, looked more like a gymnastics routine than a procedure. Inflate a set of seat cushions with a CO2 bottle to force themselves upright, crawl down a narrow aisle, wrench open a side hatch by hand, and jump. Martin Baker had already built and successfully tested a rear-facing ejection system for the Valiant and the Vulcan. When they offered the same fix for the Victor, the answer came back flat. The airframe was too complicated to fit it. The 3 men in the back climbed aboard every mission knowing exactly where they stood. If the aircraft went down low, their odds were close to nothing. The Victor saved its strangest quirks for the engine bay. Early B.1 models ran 4 Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire ASA Tot 7 engines, with a flaw nicknamed centerline closure. Fly through heavy rain or dense cloud, and enough water could flood the intakes to choke an engine out entirely, mid-flight. Picture flying a strategic nuclear bomber and having to dodge rain clouds like a man without an umbrella. But the same crescent wing that caused so much trouble handed the Victor one genuinely elegant trick. It could land itself. On final approach, ground effect, the cushion of compressed air trapped under the wing naturally lifted the nose and settled the tail, producing a smooth flare without the pilot touching a thing. Test pilots at ANAEE later shrugged the party trick off as operationally useless. It didn't matter. It was still a piece of aerodynamics nobody else in the V-Force could claim. Judge the Victor by firepower, speed, or altitude, and you'll miss its most dangerous opponent entirely. It never wore a Soviet uniform. It sat behind a desk in Whitehall. By the late 1950s, Defence Minister Duncan Sandys had begun a ruthless restructuring of Britain's aircraft industry, forcing every independent manufacturer toward consolidation. His two-group policy made the terms explicit. Every government contract, every research grant, every civil approval from now on would go to just two new conglomerates, BAC and Hawker Siddeley. Anyone who stayed outside the merger would be starved of business until they had no choice left. Sir Frederick Handley Page didn't blink. A holdover from an older generation of industrial leadership, call it personal capitalism, the kind built on one man's name over a boardroom. He refused to fold his company into anyone else's structure. His business was profitable. His victors were the backbone of Britain's nuclear deterrent. He wasn't handing control to a government bureaucracy because Whitehall told him to. That refusal made him a problem, and Whitehall doesn't forget problems quietly. The first blow landed on the HP.111, a double-deck transport derivative of the Victor, capable of carrying 200 troops or 145 civilian passengers on 4 Conway engines, cheaper to run than almost anything else on offer. The government turned it down flat, choosing instead to spend precious foreign currency importing the Lockheed C-130 Hercules from the United States, rather than let a stubborn British company survive on its own terms. When Handley Page poured its own money into commercial programs, the Dart Herald, the Jetstream, trying to stay solvent, the drain nearly finished the job. Declassified internal papers later revealed the government knew exactly how close to collapse the company was, and chose to withhold every form of support anyway. One civil servant put it in writing: it would be easier to force the merger by offering no hope of help at all. That wasn't industrial policy. That was a slow economic strangulation, planned by people who never had to look Frederick Handley Page in the eye. In 1969, the outcome arrived on schedule. Handley Page, the last major independent British aircraft manufacturer, went bankrupt and was liquidated. Sir Frederick had fought to the end to keep his company his own, and lost to a government machine built specifically to make sure he would. The final insult came after. Every drawing, every tanker conversion contract for turning surviving victors into the K.2 refueling variant was handed over to A.V. Rowe at Woodford, now folded into Hawker Siddeley, Handley Page's oldest rival. Whitehall killed the father and gave the inheritance to the enemy. By the 1960s, the doctrine underneath the whole V-force, outrun the fighters, outclimb the missiles, was already dying. In 1960, Soviet surface-to-air missiles brought down a Sia U-2 flying at 70,000 feet, and with it, the idea that altitude alone could keep a bomber safe. To stay relevant, the RAF modified the Victor B-2 to carry a new standoff weapon, the Blue Steel nuclear cruise missile, letting the bomber launch from at least 50 miles out, safely outside the range of enemy air defenses. Elegant on paper, a nightmare on the ground, Blue Steel ran on a 2-chamber Stentor Mark 101 rocket motor, burning a violently unstable mix of high-test peroxide and kerosene. High-test peroxide is an aggressive oxidizer, corrosive enough to eat through metal, unstable enough to detonate the kerosene with barely any heat or friction. Victor crews had to be airborne within 4 minutes on quick reaction alert, but the Stentor motor couldn't sit fueled in its tanks for long without corroding, which meant loading both chemicals had to happen right there on the alert line, a 30-minute procedure that left aircrew and ground crew alike sitting on top of a live bomb before the aircraft had even left the ground. When America canceled the Skybolt missile program in 1962, the Victor lost its long-range future entirely, and the RAF pushed the fleet down to low-level penetration tactics to duck under Soviet radar. Years of flying through dense, low-altitude air punished the crescent-wing with fatigue, cracking severe enough to force the Victor out of the bomber role completely by 1968. And then, in 1982, the retired bomber found its second act. When the Falklands War broke out, it was the aging Victor fleet, not the famous Vulcan, that made the entire campaign possible. On April 20th, 1982, Squadron leader J.G. Elliott flew a Victor K-2 out of Ascension Island on a maritime radar reconnaissance sortie lasting 14 hours and 45 minutes, sweeping 150,000 square miles of ocean around South Georgia for Argentine ships and submarines, the longest reconnaissance sortie in aviation history at the time. There's something quietly, deeply British about what happened next. When the war ended, the Vulcan got the headlines, the books, the documentaries, the one dramatic bombing run everyone remembers. Nobody wrote the same story about the dozen Victor tankers that pumped fuel into that Vulcan through a southern Atlantic storm so it could reach the target at all. The bomber got the laurels. The tanker got metal fatigue and a footnote. The real winner in this story never needed to make noise to prove it. It just did the job, kept the others alive, and flew home before sunrise. Not every Victor went out that quietly. On May 3, 2009, at Bruntingthorpe Airfield, a Victor K.2 named XM715, Tina, retired 16 years earlier with no permit to fly, was rolled out for a routine fast taxi demonstration. Tina had other ideas. As the aircraft picked up speed, Captain Bob Prothero called for throttles back. His volunteer co-pilot froze at the controls and didn't respond. That crescent wing, still capable of real lift at speed, took the opening it was given and lifted the whole aircraft roughly 30 feet into the air. Nobody had decided to fly. Tina flew anyway. Prothero wrestled the throttles back by force and put her down hard near the edge of the runway. The Civil Aviation Authority reviewed the incident and declined to open a formal investigation. Nobody had the heart to punish an old lady for missing the sky. Not every Victor got that kind of mercy. XH-673 stood gate guard at RAF Marham for years after its 1993 retirement, a fixture the base had grown used to seeing every morning. In early 2020, despite a public campaign to save it, the RAF declared its structure unsafe and ordered it scrapped. In February 2021, the Air Force released its own time-lapse footage of the demolition, excavators tearing the crescent wings and fuselage of a Cold War strategic bomber into scrap aluminum, filmed and published like nothing was lost. A machine that once sat on permanent alert to defend the country was, in the end, dismantled by the very service it spent 30 years protecting. 4 Victors survive in Britain today. XH-648, the last B.1 airframe left anywhere in the world, just came out of a 5-year restoration at Duxford. Maid Marian XH-672 sits at Cosford. Lusty Lindy XL-231 is preserved at Elvington. And in a field in Ohio, half buried in undergrowth on Walter Saplata's private collection, the nose section of XL-191 still sits where it was towed decades ago, rusting quietly under American sky, thousands of miles from the runway it was built to defend. The Victor was designed in an age of fear, built to carry the kind of weapon that ends cities. It spent most of its working life doing the opposite, keeping other aircraft in the sky, filling tanks in Atlantic storms, scanning empty ocean for ships nobody else could see. It never got the headlines the Vulcan got. It never needed them. Somewhere between a badly painted sign on a country road and a scrapyard excavator 40 years later, the Handley Page Victor quietly became the kind of hero that never once asked to be noticed, and did the job anyway.